Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. Today, I'm joined by common guest on our show now, our legal analyst and friend of the show. We love to have him on here, Rick Hoeg of Hoeg Law. My friend, how are you today? It's good to see you.
I'm doing well. I love December. I love the holiday season. I'm looking forward to this conversation, which just has some absolutely crazy stuff going on with it. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, it's good to see you. I agree. I'm not I don't know if this is surprising to anyone, but I'm not a very festive person. But I like Christmas trees. And I like getting real Christmas trees. I just think that that's first of all, it's like a cool tradition going way back pre-Christianity. It's just something we've been doing. And I like going and buying the real Christmas tree. So we got that. I don't set it up, of course. We get it into the house and all that. And then Micah puts all the lights on it and the ornaments. But so I'm totally with you. It's an exciting time of year, especially with the nieces and nephews and all that. You get the presents. They're excited. There's an element of wonder. They're not jaded yet, you know?
Hopefully never. Yeah. No, I like marking time with those kinds of things. So it's an enjoyable time. We aren't quite into the doldrums in Michigan winter. So
right.
I'm in a good mood.
Good, my friend. Well, it's good to have you here, Rick, and it's good to be with all of you out there as well. A couple months ago, I reached out. Rick's on the show to talk about something legal. I don't know. It's probably like, I would say every 6 weeks, maybe every 4 to 6 weeks between Duke and our show, Sacred Symbols. And then we have you on for other things. They'll see this after the God of War spoiler cast, but you'll have seen Rick on the God of War spoiler cast as well. So we're having on more game coverage as well. But I emailed you a couple months ago when this stuff with the studio that I thought was Zaum, but is actually Zaum, as far as I understand.
Are you supposed to say it like a word? I didn't know that apparently, until now either.
Yeah, apparently it's meant to be said Zaum, as I understand it. And these are the guys that made Disco Elysium. And we talked about them on Sacred Symbols. The game came out in 2021 on PS4 and PS5, but it also came to PC in 2019 first. That's where it became famous. But we talked about them because they had like a weird Lenin thing, and they're socialist collectivists at the very least, probably Marxists in some sense. So that's important. So we thought that was interesting and weird because the game was so popular. How are they going to deal with all of this? And it almost is. It's literary in the sense that it happened exactly the way I thought it would. Whether they're right or wrong in this situation we'll go over, I don't really know. But it's just funny that this happened to them because they're so anti-capitalist that capitalism corrupted them.
I seem to recall them going and accepting a game award with something like that message talking about collectivism. And it is interesting because if you haven't played Disco Elysium, if you're out there, it does talk about economic models. It talks about ownership. It talks about creativity in the face of business. And so it is a real kind of art imitating life. And no, we're not going to be able to talk to you, dear listener or viewer, on who's right on this. We're talking about Estonian translations and claims of business stuff. We can walk you through some of the things that I think about it. But it is an interesting thing to have happen, in particular to the creative forces behind Disco Elysium, which is a game I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I haven't played it yet. And I don't, people think I have more of a political problem with it. And I'm like, I actually don't. I love nonviolence. I'm all about nonviolent gameplay, which I know is what it's predicated on. I don't like isometric CRPG type games. I just
it reminds you too much of the old D&D games or what have you.
Yeah, it's like I just don't. It's like when people tell me, we have a joke on our show that people always tell me to play games like Pillars of Eternity, and it's like, do you know anything about me? Like, why are you recommending me these games? But this game is so interesting in the way it's set up and what you can do in the statistics and what you're actually trying to do that I very much want to play it at some point. I think I own it already on PS4 or PS5, so I'll get there at some point. But why I wanted to have a mind like yours on the show, Rick, for us to dive deep into these things as we usually do, is because I feel like this situation is so complex, not only because it's Estonian and not only because it's foreign in some way, but because it's complicated. In doing a little bit of research, and I read for hours about it, but a lot of it is, there aren't a lot of sources, really. A lot of people are not writing about this. A lot of people aren't reaching out to them. I certainly haven't reached out to them, and they're not talking, and they're in litigation now, I think. So everyone's going to probably be
well
quiet.
Advised to not talk to folks like us, to be honest with you.
Right, exactly. Probably, which is why I've been surprised to find like little things where they did talk to PC Gamer and they did give a comment to games industry and all of this. But to set everyone up and interrupt me if you feel like I got anything wrong or you want to add anything. ZAUM, ZA/UM, as you might have seen them, is the developer behind Disco Elysium, but in fact is a artists collective that was also formed. Go ahead. You already want?
No, I don't want. I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
It appears to me everybody's reporting on it as if they're two separate concepts,
right?
That use the same name, which just makes things even more complicated, right, to understand. So this all kicks off with the dissolution of the quote unquote cultural association, which, as best I can tell from a legal perspective, isn't a thing. Like, it isn't a separate body.
Right.
Right. When we talk about corporations or limited liability companies and people quiz me about these things, the reason they exist, and for the record, as a full disclosure, this is probably not a shock to you, Colin, or anybody else watching or listening to this, I am not well versed in Estonian entity corporation law. So we will be talking about it as if, on the broad strokes basis, an Estonian company is like any other Western type company,
right.
Being that it's a legal fiction, which is a phrase I love, in which the law just says this other thing exists and we will treat it as a separate entity than the people. Versus when you talk about something like a cultural association or a club or anything else that you can think of on this type of thing, the law doesn't care. The law isn't looking at that as anything separate. And so you have these two things with the same name, one of which is probably important for litigation and legal requirements, and one of which is probably not. We're making certain assumptions about Estonian recognition, but I suspect the cultural association is more of a club.
Yeah,
didn't mean to jump on you there.
Oh no, that's all good. It's all good. It's an important predicate because you're right. Also, in the sense that based on the nature of their political and economic outlook, they probably wouldn't have incorporated or something until the money was necessary to make the actual product, which is where the other offshoot that we're actually talking about here today comes from. So you're totally right. It's an important thing to put at the very predicate. And this happened. So the Cultural Association, from my research, founded in 2016, founded in quotes. Obviously Estonia out by Finland and hugged by Russia. And a novelist named Robert Kurvitz is at the center of all of this. He was the driving force behind the collective and the idea that would become Disco Elysium, primarily from a failed novel he wrote called Sacred and Terrible Air. And this was based on an RPG system that I guess they were building, not unlike a D&D type system where they're like where you can pull subject matter in and out of it. And they were originally calling that Elysium. The disco from it, I didn't know, comes from I learn, I guess, in Greek. So it's not weird stuff going on with the word Disco Elysium and all of this. But it was also, just to set it up, and again, to reiterate what you were saying too, Hoeg, we'll go into the legal aspects of it as best we can, but I think it's just an interesting story to explain because I really think it's so complicated and people aren't talking about it because it's intimidating. It was intimidating for me when I sat down. I was like, I don't really even know where to begin. But now I think I understand it.
And I think, as you were saying, right, you contacted me a few months ago and I essentially rejected you. I said, I don't think we have enough to have any idea what is going on here. And then you contacted me again recently because we do have a little bit more from the litigation and the lawsuit. And I said, yeah, I think we can now talk about what everybody is saying because it's all kind of shadowy innuendo for months, like throughout October, various interviews and plucking out things. And we have a little bit more now. So I'm glad we waited because I think we needed the very end of what we've seen in the last few weeks. Indeed.
And I couldn't find, even to translate, I couldn't find the Estonian lawsuit or anything like that. I don't know if you saw it either. I guess they release data or details about what people are saying to each other. So apparently there's been requests for documents between the parties and all of that, but there's no text of a lawsuit or anything like that I could find.
I have not seen anything. We've kind of got second and third hand reports from various places. So we now know what the accusation is, which is effectively what I was waiting for to discuss these things, because we've had fraud claims and we just have like Medium posts and litigation by Medium post. Never recommended. I'm looking at you, ZeniMax. But in general, when you're looking at these various things, you want to see something like a legal claim, at least if you're in my shoes, before you start talking about it in earnest. So we do have that. We do have a notion of what they're arguing about now, so we can get to that when we get to it. But right now, since I've jumped all over the introduction, we have a cultural association of a failed novelist with a D&D campaign. We also have a company eventually coming into being when you need money to make a computer game.
Right. No, it's exactly right. That brings us to the next point, which is that at some point, the so-called cultural association realized that it needed capital to make this game. So an Estonian millionaire named Margus Linname, as I don't know. I'm sure we're going to destroy these people's names.
We're going to butcher it. We are.
He's apparently a pharmaceutical magnate who owns a lot of things in Estonia and came in as a somewhat benevolent sort of money guy. He was
He's money.
We returned to him later because if it was still with him, none of these problems would have happened, which is something that or probably wouldn't have happened. Something interesting I learned in my research, and I'm sure you did as well. So at this point, Zaum and the people with Robert Kurbitz and others, and we'll get into some of these other guys, get with Margus Linname, and they create what seems to be the actual company. And for some reason, although I understand why this happened, Margus Linname has the majority stake, and the minority shares, as far as I can tell, are split between a bunch of the creatives at this collective developer, which is in Estonia. And also by this point, I think starting to work out of England and other places too, which becomes relevant because apparently they might be sued in England as well, or in the UK.
Yeah, let me talk about that beat for just a moment, right? Because you've got companies that start up all over the place in video gaming and technology and everywhere. And you very often have, here it's creatives, but you might also have what I would call the founders, the tech people, the idea man, whatever it might be. And when you need the money, you have a negotiation. You have an open negotiation about what this is worth to you going forward. And to the extent that you're looking at a computer game and a collective of people that at least ostensibly present as not motivated by money or profit, which is going to come back into this story, it is not a surprise to me. It's not a shock that the guy with the bag of money comes in and says, bare minimum, and we don't have exact percentages here, bare minimum, I'm 51%, right? I'm the money. This thing doesn't exist without me. And you can often have that, whether you're looking at a Series A offering in the United States or apparently an Estonian pharmaceutical magnate with a bag of money. And so this kind of situation is kind of a word of caution. If I were sitting across the table from a client right here, it's like, okay, when I say you have a minority share position and it's a little bit difficult to cover you in those circumstances, this is kind of what that looks like. If you give up majority ownership of your company, if you don't have this kind of control, we can put in contractual protections, which don't appear to exist here, especially if you're not motivated to seek them. But when you're actually selling your company, when you're getting money for shares, you're losing majority control, you're selling something. This is a conversation, if you can't tell, Colin, I've had a lot with a lot of entrepreneurs.
This is your specialty, right? I mean, this is kind of like your wheelhouse.
I love entrepreneurship. I love dreamers, right? This is what I say to people. I left big law because I wanted to work more with people that were, betting it all on themselves and moving forward with these companies. But when you go and you look for a venture capital fund or a hedge fund or whatever status you have as a company, the biggest question is, what are you selling? What is the price of that money? And understanding that. And I think if we're giving the benefit of the doubt to this whole story that we're going to talk about, part of that benefit of the doubt is these people didn't seem so interested in corporate governance or control or figuring out what this would look like if it were a massive success. And I don't know if it was a massive success, but certainly Disco Elysium took off in a number of different areas. It was one of my games of the year on the PC side from whatever that year was, 2019 maybe?
Yeah, 2019 is when it came to the PC.
And so as I tell my clients, it's always better to hash these things out before you're a massive success, because the weaknesses in your organizational structure or your personality clashes or anything else, they become instantly apparent when there's a bag of money on the table and you have to fight over it.
Yeah, it's interesting because part of me feels like, how could you get yourself into that situation? But the reason that I used the word benevolent before was because, and they say this later on, I think in the Estonian Express piece, which is a newspaper, like an extensive newspaper article that I've only read through translation and through coverage. So I can't, obviously we don't speak Estonian.
Colin and I don't speak Estonian, so translation is the only way.
But they say something interesting about this Linname guy, which is that they had assumed there was some sort of agreement, apparently, that he would sell the rest of the company to the people that already owned it. In other words, they didn't feel threatened that he owned a majority, because eventually it was purported that he would divest and sell the shares to the creatives so that they can split the situation up as a true collective, which is what they wanted to be. Yeah. And they claim that was not able to happen. And we'll talk about who comes in later, because these new owners come in and they don't have that intention, and they don't have to have that intention. They actually have control over everything. Yeah. So does that sound accurate to you so far, based on the way I'm?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into the fraud claim, I think, at the end when we get to that, because there is a legitimate fraud claim as part of this, as to how ownership changes hands to essentially somebody that they view as hostile to their intentions, the creative forces again. And so that is legitimate as best I can tell. I can't say that it's true. We don't know. We're not in these rooms. We're not looking at these documents. But there is a claim that even in America, I could say could constitute a kind of defrauding of the shareholders that we'll get to. We'll get to.
Yeah, we will.
Spoiler alert.
I want to take a moment because I promised earlier that I'd bring in a few other people, because it's not just this Robert Kurvitz guy. There's a few other important names here as well. Helen Hindpeer this name comes up a lot. She is apparently one of the writers, along with Kurvitz, of the game. And more importantly, this name Alexander Rostov, or Rostov. I'm sure I'm saying it with no Russian inflection, but he's the lead artist and designer of the game. So with these three people, you have the brain trust of the game's world, at the very least, if not the building of the game. And what ends up happening behind the scenes is that at the end of 2021, Liname had already divested, apparently, from the company. And we'll get into these new people in a moment. But when that happened and power changed hands, Kurvitz, Hindpeer, and Rostov were let go. And they didn't say anything for apparently 8 or 9 months. I'm sure they were under NDA and probably getting paid severance and all of that, so they weren't able to do so. But with their removal, the argument comes that the IP has basically been stolen, in quotes. I don't know if they use that exact terminology, from the people who own it. And
they use fraud a lot. Fraud a lot.
And that the cultural association, and this is where it comes back to the cultural association, this thing that doesn't really exist. There's almost an insinuation that the cultural association owns the IP, that the cultural association owns the art and the key art and all of the things for the sequel and the original game. So let me leave it there. Is there anything else that we need to add before we get into what actually happened when they started talking?
Well, I would say that I think there is that insinuation. I think that is an accurate assessment of some of the things you can get from the comments in the Medium posts and whatnot. I don't know that they'd actually advance that particular ball from a legal perspective. Again, you see this kind of conversation a lot from founders, because if you're the idea guy or the idea gal and you're looking at this, there is an ownership on a kind of personal level of what this thing is. And that's often another kind of conversation we have, which is like, okay, when you put this into the company, if you're going to go get a sack of money, one of the things they're going to require all of the intellectual property creators to do is assign that to the company. That if I'm going to have an ownership stake, I need to make sure that everything that is related to this endeavor that I'm otherwise funding is a part of this bucket of assets that exist at the company. So I can't tell you how they documented this. I can't tell you what's required in Estonia. I can tell you in the United States, generally speaking, you're going to have an investor. It's an arm's length type investor. They're going to ask you to make sure all the intellectual property is part of the company. I don't think at the end of the day, they really fight that as much as they fight who owns this company and whether or not the majority stake was sold legitimately.
Right.
And that becomes a very significant fight. But as of right now in our story, I think they do intimate, like founders do, like creatives do, that there's something untoward about their mental effort creating something and it being the company's. When, look, I'm a corporate lawyer. I structure these documents. I get these things set up. At some level, you can't fund an entity if you're not otherwise making sure the intellectual property is held by that entity. So while I am sympathetic to founders saying these kinds of things or intimating them, I have to believe that anybody putting any kind of significant amount of money in a company endeavor would make sure that the intellectual property is properly owned by the entity.
Yeah, and it's also worth iterating that though things have changed, companies, publishers, and investors would bully the shit out of developers and get their IP out of them left, right, and center. This is one of the reasons that Sony had such a hard time getting PSN off the ground compared to Xbox Live Arcade, is because they would just go to these people and be like, well, we want the IP. And they're like, well, you can't have the game. Like, you can have the license to it or whatever. So yeah, things have changed. And that's why I think that this situation, if it's true, and I actually don't believe it's true the way it's totally laid out, but we'll get into all of that. And here's where things, I guess, fall apart. Yep. So these guys are all operating, and this Margus Liname guy in 2021 at some point sells the majority of the company. And he sells it to a holding company called, and again, I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, Tutrek. And it's owned by two Estonians named Ilmar Kampis and Tonis Havel. And when this happens, and this is according to a Medium post written by Kurvitz, He says, quote, as soon as they became majority shareholders, we were quickly excluded from daily operations. Our employment was terminated and our access to the company's information was shut off. So they claim that at the end of that year, 2021, that calendar year, they're out. And this happens because these two guys come in. Now, before we get into the actual claim of fraud, which I want to get into, it's worth noting as a predicate again that, and I don't know how much of this is true because like we can't get into the source material, but there is a claim that one of these guys is like a convicted fraudster. Is that true? Is that how you understand it as well? One of the buyers?
Yeah, I think game industry says Havel was convicted of investment fraud in 2015. Now, there's a couple of things to understand here, right? That's included because it's useful for evaluating someone's truthfulness and how you're going to look at these stories, because we're all just evaluating on a 30,000 foot basis from across an ocean on this stuff. I will say there are people that right their wrongs and that do fine in business in the future. I am not the first to recommend necessarily getting into business with a convicted investment fraud person from Estonia for my clients. But I'm also in the habit of reading news articles and saying, okay, that's a useful bit of information. It's somewhat designed to make you disbelieve everything they say, might be worthy of doing. But I also just caution on that, which is we don't know what kind of investment fraud. We don't know if that matches what happens or what is accused of happening here. To me, it's a bit of a red herring. And I would just caution just immediately throwing out everything that side says because of that particular issue, while still understanding, yep, you can discount it. Go ahead and discount.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm also, I hate to say this with skepticism, but it's true. I'm also not confident in the judiciousness of the Estonian system. I don't know how good it is. So yeah, you're right. Like we don't really know the nature of this guy, but it seems germane information. They brought it up. I wanted to put that out there at the very least. Yeah,
well, they're going to accuse him of investment fraud. We don't know exactly whether it's the same type, but certainly, I think it's worth noting. I'm not begrudging games industry or anybody else noting this. I think it's useful information. I just don't think we can just take it as, okay, so they must be lying. That's the only thing I would caution against.
Fair enough. All right, so let's get into the claim fraud. Hey. They contend that they were removed for seeking financial documents relating to the deal. And so the argument here, and I'll get into their quote, is not so much that there's fraud, which is one thing, but that they claim that they were removed because they were onto it. And that's an important thing. So there's almost like I don't know, this is like racketeer, some sort of, I don't know what it is. It's like some sort of weird thing here where they feel like they're onto like this criminal enterprise and there's people being, I guess, protected and shielded from that or whatever. But I'll let them speak for themselves. Here's what they say. Quote,
yeah.
We have now learned that Tutrek, that's the company owned by the holding company, must have obtained control over Zaum Studio by fraud. We believe the money used by Tutrek to buy the majority stake was taken illegally from Zaum Studio itself. Money that belonged to the studio and all shareholders, but was used for the benefit of one. Money that should have gone towards making a sequel. We believe that these actions, which in our view and the view of our lawyers amount to criminal wrongdoing punishable by up to 3 years imprisonment, were perpetrated by Ilmar Compass and Tony Havel with the support of, and now we're going to get another person in here, Kaur Kender, another minority shareholder. I'm going to get to that guy in a minute. That's another important player. We're getting in all these names. These are almost like, and this is going to sound culturally insensitive, but we're almost dealing with like Lord of the Rings names at this point. I have no idea who any of these people are. I can't possibly keep these names straight.
A lot of folks.
Way too Scandinavian, way too Eastern European for me. And a lot of vowels as well. But that quote is interesting, Hoeg, because first of all, they make this claim of imprisonment and illegality. I guess their lawyers, they seem to be comfortable talking because of their lawyers. But the claim here is that, and correct me again if I'm wrong, that they somehow tapped money within the company to buy the company. And then explain this to me, because if this is true, then this does go back to the so-called benevolent Margus Linnamäe, right? Because he must have also somehow been involved in this, I guess. Talk to me about this.
You kind of get to it in the most recent article on Games Industry Biz that talks about what it is that they mean. I will say, again, I don't much care for litigation by Medium Post. And I do think, especially non-lawyers, and this is probably vetted but not written by lawyers, describe these things with a little bit more emotionality than I think is useful for conveying what it is they're talking about. So by the time you get to the sentence of, we have now learned that this party that we hate must have obtained the control of our company by fraud, my immediate reaction as a lawyer is to say, okay, well, hold on now. that is a big time claim. I'm going to need more than you putting up a sentence like that. certainly the notion of you use the money in the company to buy out the interest in the company is very, very interesting. What do you mean? How do you mean it? This is where I think you contact me and I say, I still don't have any idea what this means. And so I didn't want to talk about it too much. Then we go over to like this November 25th article from Games Industry Biz. Mm-hmm. And so all of this is happening in terms of time frame, folks. All the information we're getting out of this is like October and November in a series of kind of actions and articles. Very well covered, I would say. I want to give credit where it's due, by Games Industry Biz on this stuff. And it's late November, roughly American Thanksgiving, when we start to get details from PC Gamer, from Games Industry Biz, on what this thing actually looks like. And it's described as follows. Can I read this, Colin?
Yeah, please do.
All right. So it says, according to the Estonia Express via PC Gamer, the latest dispute follows the rights to Disco Elysium 2. Kind of. I think that's probably actually not what actually happened here. 4 concept sketches, said to be the first look at the sequel, were allegedly purchased by Tutrecki. The sketches were said to be sold to Tutrecki for $1, specifically €1, but we're going to use $1 here, and then resold back to the company for $4.8 million, which matches up to what Kurvitz and Rostov claim is the $4.8 million used to purchase the interest in the company. So what it's describing is essentially fraud, right? Like if this happened, their accusation in the medium charge under American law, again, just disclaim that I don't have any idea what Estonian
no post-Soviet legal expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
I have no expertise in Estonian law on this, but just talking about this naturally, whenever we talk about a company, the assets are the company's. You can't just kind of subsume them for the benefit of one party, because if you were going to use the money in a company, it's supposed to be distributed equitably based on what the equity ownership is. So when you see reference in the Medium Post or the Games Industry Biz article, or even in the interviews that they give about, hey, this was our money, this was to be distributed to partners, if at all, or withheld in the company to be used for the making of a sequel, that makes sense to my understanding of how an American company would work. And if you've got someone at the company, it gets a little bit unclear as to who they're even accusing this of, someone at the company selling these particular assets. And I think the fact that they are Disco Elysium 2 assets doesn't matter at all. This could be anything. This is, if you think about like the old Brewster's Millions or some other kind of pop culture reference you might have, it's essentially just whatever it is. We're selling it to you for $1 and then we'll pay $5 million to get it back, is just taking $5 million out of the company and swooping it into somebody's account. And then I believe the end of this is then you're going to give that money back for a giant equity portion. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to pay off somebody and or squeeze out the creatives that we don't like. And yes, if this is in fact true, if this is an accurate description of what happened, that looks for all the world like a fraudulent conveyance designed to move assets out of the company for the benefit of a single person. And yeah, I mean, from afar, that starts to look like these creatives have a real argument.
Now, they introduced this name, Kaur Kender, and I went on Moby Games to find out who this guy was. He's the executive producer, but he's been with them since the very beginning. So at some point, there was some schism internally. Now, producers are not creatives per se, so it would be, I would imagine, a situation where that would be easier to get hold of a person like that. That's more about the organization and the doing or the getting done of things. So his name's introduced as well. And so all of this kind of exists in the ether, this accusation. But then Zalem releases a statement to gamesindustry.biz defending itself, and they make a lot of counter accusations. Before we get to those, is there anything that I haven't brought up that's relevant, you think?
The only thing I think is when we get to these counter accusations and they're describing what happened, and again, we got so many time frames running, right? So we're getting this information in October, November of 2022. The legal fight is happening in 2022. You heard Colin reference one of the claims that the creatives have, which is that they're not being allowed to see the internal documents of the company. Again, I can't speak to Estonia, but in general, every jurisdiction in the United States has what we would call shareholder rights. And those can be inspection rights. You're going to go get to see who the shareholders of the company are. You're going to get to review their books and records. That's going to vary by jurisdiction, but generally you're going to be able to go and look at what you own. And what they are arguing is that there's a similar type statute or law in Estonia, and they are being specifically blocked out of this so that they can hide what they did in 2021, I want to say. So last year is when all this is going to happen with respect to these claims about these particular creatives. And the other thing I would add is I believe it's part of the story that Kender, the executive producer, is co-opted by the business folks to fire the creatives. That's an aspect of this kind of schism and relation driving here. And then Kender, I believe, leaves because of health reasons.
Yeah, he's put on leave or something like that.
Yeah. And so it does look, in terms of format, and we can't speak to the specifics here, like a palace coup. I mean, like it has that feel to it. I don't know what drives that. But yeah, I think this is a perfect time, Colin, to go into. So they've now been accused by Medium Post. The collective has dropped off. People have left a year before. It's the whole brain trust for Disco Elysium. They come out with a very early statement that says, it's all going to be fine. We're looking forward to Disco Elysium 2. Don't worry about it. And then they come out with a much grander statement about what happened.
Right. They released, to your point, a social media statement that was, I think, largely panned as insufficient, which I agree, although it sucks that when you're accused of things, if, let's say, they're not guilty of doing anything wrong, it sucks that you have to defend yourself in that situation, but you still have to defend yourself at some point and say something. So here's what they say to GamesIndustry.biz.
Yeah.
And they say the firings happened because of, quote, limited to no engagement in their responsibilities and work, including not working at all for almost 2 years while still being paid by the studio and forcing colleagues to compensate for their lack of effort, creating a toxic work environment that is antithetical to the Zaum culture and team productivity, misconduct in interacting with other colleagues that includes verbal abuse and gender discrimination. I thought that was kind of throwing in a little bit of a grenade. Attempting to illegally sell to other gaming companies Zaum's intellectual property with the aim of undermining the rest of the team. End quote. And it's odd because they put them in bullet points, so that's how I introduced them. But and they say a couple interesting things here, which is that, and I didn't know this, Zaum is more than 100 people now, and they have multiple games, including the sequel, in development here. And they go on to say, quote, Zaum cannot and will not tolerate egregious misconduct, even from individuals who, along with the broader team, have contributed to a game that we are exceptionally proud of and that continues to capture imaginations across the globe. In addition to creativity and innovation, Zaum also stands for professionalism, kindness, decency, and fairness, which we expect from all of our employees. It would be short-sighted to accept anything less, as we need team players for the highly collaborative process that is creating games, end quote. So knowing creatives and being one myself, although I think these guys are getting to the point of auteurish in some way, which is cool. A lot of people that are creative are hard to work with. And it's not that they're dickheads. I've known dickheads. I don't think I'm a dickhead. But
legal term of art right there.
Right, exactly. But rather, it's like, just leave me alone. Let me do what I need to do. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to drive this thing, whatever. I totally get that mentality, or at least understand that mentality because I've been around it. And it seems like if you believe Zaum's claims, and you can tell me if I'm wrong in interpreting this, they're trying to turn it into a real company and not this collective. When you have 100 heads, you can't have people siphoning money off of you and doing all of these kinds of things. And it is important to note that even if they were removed, they still own a piece of the company, right? So they still are owed something, some dividend or bonus or whatever their structure is. So what do you think about Zaum's extensive response here on GamesIndustry.biz?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that are in here. One of which is that there is some corroboration, at least that Games Industry Biz did, to go and get their own sources that they described that said that there is some truth to this. There are people at the company talking about toxic auteurs and things like that. Creativity is very interesting to me. I'm a business analytics guy. And so creativity is one of those things where you can bang your head against the wall if you're the analytics person trying to set budgets and project timelines and things like that. And I often describe this as, creativity is Don Draper laying on a couch sometimes,
right?
And thinking through the problem. And it doesn't look like much if you're on the outside. And that can be a big time struggle for the folks that are bean counting and trying to get a product out and that kind of thing. So you have those kinds of benign frictions that are perfectly normal. But you can also have toxicity, right? We have seen that. That's a story that's pretty common in the gaming industry, even at indie levels, even at levels that aren't giant publishers. We are seeing that kind of king of my own kingdom and you'll bow to me and this was my idea and all this stuff. So it's certainly a possibility. I think in the current zeitgeist, the kind of cultural moment we're in, I think the business folks at Zaum know what they're doing. I mean, they say a lot of the words that are really going to resonate with people as problematic for these particular folks. So certainly if they're true, they are a problem. if they're not true or if they're kind of gray area, this is, I think he's described it as throwing a grenade with things like gender discrimination. Those are things that people are going to pay attention to.
Definitely.
It's so hard to tell from across an ocean and with legitimate kind of descriptions of fraud against takeovers. And I think you described it right, that if we don't have all the rest of this noise in the signal, you could be looking at a kind of typical friction of we're the people with the spark. We built that spark, it made some noise, and now the money men are coming in and making it an enterprise, and we've lost the spark. Right? That's a problem that you have with creatives in general. It's like, I don't want to do this. And then when you talk about the speeches that they gave at the Game Awards, who they are, what their game represents, it's easy to imagine a world in which they might be toxic. They might also just be hating what it is that they're building. Right? Like, as it comes to fruition, I don't want to be the man. I don't want to sell out. I don't want to do these things. And all of that can kind of come at once. And then if you actually did have the company stolen from you by fraud, well, then that creates even more friction.
Yeah, it's one thing that I think lends credence to this idea of trying to make it serious is this was an interesting nugget in the story. And I again, this is why I'm so glad that I took the time to read it, because I just don't feel like people are connecting these dots, because it's a little intimidating. But Ed Tomaszewski is the president of Zaum now, and I knew that name, and they were talking about it. He founded Private Division, which was a Take-Two, which is a Take-Two vertical. That's a real person. In other words, like that's a real gaming industry person that they brought in as the president. So now it's a level deeper than just having investment and having a big game and trying to make something. Now they have like a real name that can actually control a company like this, which indicates to me. And again, it's just tangential that they must have sold him on something. Like they must be like, there's nothing here that's bad that you need to worry about. Here's the real situation. In other words, I just don't think you'd be able to court someone like him unless maybe he's gotten into a horrible position as president of the company, but I just doubt it. It seems like, and hiring more than 100 people, multinational company, doesn't seem like they're having trouble not only drawing talent, but keeping it. And I thought that there was an interesting thing, because you said there was context, and there is context, because I guess they have a more literal translation of the Estonian newspaper article, or at least they quote it like that. And so going back to a guy we brought up earlier, who's Robert Kurvitz, who is the writer and the kind of the guy who imagined this all up. And then, of course, Alexander Rostov, the artist. They claim that they created a toxic environment, in quotes, while, quote, humiliating colleagues and intending to steal IP, end quote. And the interviews made Kurvitz particularly seem antagonistic and maybe even misogynistic. So this is what I was saying before, that they're going to play hardball with these dudes. That's a serious accusation. And this was interesting too. Quote, one source that spoke to GamesIndustry.biz, who asked to remain anonymous, described the situation as not black and white, and said that the long-term staff were reluctant to speak out about Kurvitz's behavior because they respected him and felt like they owed him for their positions, end quote. Yep. It notes that Kurvitz and Rostov had, quote unquote, delusions of grandeur, of recapturing their IP. And it is described, I guess, more and agnostically rather, as, quote, CEO corporate scheming on one side and a toxic auteur on the other side, end quote. So I guess the way it's left, at least from what we know materially, is that it's complicated. I don't know how this is going to play out. What is again, with our very limited understanding and knowledge of the situation, do you anticipate that this would go to court, or do you think that they'll be able to figure this out behind the scenes, buy those guys out, and then those guys can use that money to go make a new studio and probably really blow up? Because while I doubt Disco Elysium 2 is not going to sell well, people don't follow through on their promises of not buying things and stuff. You see that. I always used to say that when EA would win Consumerist Worst Company in the World every year, and then they would just get bigger. And it's like, they don't care, man. As long as you keep paying them, they only care about the green money in your pocket. So I just imagine a situation where it's like, guys, just get the fuck out of here. Here's some money. Go make your game, another game. You shouldn't have sold your IP to a businessman that sold it to us. If you didn't want it, it's ours. You know, I don't anticipate it. I don't imagine a situation where they're walking away with Disco Elysium, which seems to be what they think is going to happen, or at least want.
Well, the interesting thing about the fraud, to the extent it exists, which I view as kind of the Trump argument, and I mean that as the key argument, this is not a political position I'm taking, is if that's true, I don't know that control actually goes back to them, right? You'd unwind that transaction, you try to figure this thing out And I don't know what the Estonian equitable principles of jurisdiction on this stuff are, but the easiest thing to imagine is you try to make people pay on either ends, and you would have leverage if you are wronged to potentially bring it up to criminal authorities and things like that. That's why you see the reference to 3 years in prison in the Medium post. That to me is the biggest argument. But assuming that is a little bit more complicated than is presented right this second, which, like every other aspect of the story, I'm fully expecting another article in another month to say, oh, that's a wrong description of what happened and the 4.8 million was given for this or what have you. Assuming that isn't as clear as they present it in their arguments, then generally speaking, you'd say, let's get rid of them. Let's make sure that we settle out and leave. The issue that I would see from that is that all works if you're relatively kind of rational business and, most importantly, profit-oriented actors. Right now, you need to feed your family, you need to keep the lights on, but there's other stories of like the Zaum Collective being in burned out Estonian buildings for the first years of their idea making and things like that. So the one thing I'd be cautious of if I'm the business runner here, and assuming again that I didn't commit criminal fraud in order to gain that position, is that you aren't dealing with a negotiating actor that is the normal kind of situational negotiator that you would think, right? If I'm sitting across from somebody, I say, okay, here's our leverage, here's your leverage. We want this to go away. You'd like some money. We figure this out in that particular way. If they just come out and say, we want Disco back, we don't care about any amount of money. We think we have at least a colorable fraud claim that is going to wreck this company if we bring it. The discovery that we can show, the court trial itself, whatever it might be, and we just want to burn the thing down. At least as they describe themselves and the stories that I've read about them, it does seem like the kind of actor that might just be wild card enough to do that, even if you were offering them millions to go away. And so that's what I would be most concerned of from the business perspective. From the creative perspective, I would imagine, based on the pedigree of the three people, the designer, the writer, and the artist, you could go crowdfund the heck out of anything that you wanted right now. You don't have to call it Disco Elysium. You can call it, I don't know, pop rock Valhalla.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Like it's so the going all the way back to the Microsoft Apple like look and feel stuff in the 80s, like you can get away with really, really copying the shit out of something in video games and no one's going to go after you. It's like I said about Iga. He dared Konami to go after him with those bloodstained 8-bit games, absolute facsimiles of Castlevania. And so I think you're right. Like they are anarchical and they might see this as an interesting opportunity. And I looked at this and it made me respect them more seeing this quote, because we didn't really bring this guy up, Martin Lugia, who is technically the founder of the Collective and the organizer of the Collective. And he's actually the one that wrote the original
He
Medium
started
post.
it all.
Right.
Yeah.
But I loved this because he was asked by website Game Pressure, and I don't know if you saw this article, but he was asked, what about your interaction with capitalism? Like, is it ironic that this is what ended up happening to you? And I loved his answer. He said, well, I even see it, quote, well, I even see it as fair, if not entirely intentional. Why should we get to make a successful critique of capital in a world of suffering and not suffer for it? End quote. And I thought that was awesome. I was like, that's a real full embrace of art and principle. If there's one thing I realized about these dudes, it's that they believe it. They seem to really believe it. And I respect the shit out of that. I respect the shit out of principle. Even if I don't agree with you, it's them being able, Hoeg, to see from a top level, like, wow, it's like Rage Against the Machine. The reason I've always been comfortable listening to Rage Against the Machine and liking them is because they're hypocrites. They're total hypocrites. They say a lot, but they also live millionaire lives and have lived very secure lives for 30 years. And they say a lot, but it doesn't quite line up with their lifestyles. I don't know that I get the vibe from these guys that they give a shit. Like, and it's interesting.
Now, we're looking at it from afar, but I tend to agree. I saw nothing in all the stuff that I read or looked at on this particular topic that has that kind of gleam of, oh, you're just presenting as this. Right now, that might not be the case. We're only getting kind of things through a couple of filters here, but they make these kinds of statements, these grandiose statements. And if you do play Disco at some point, Colin, you will see that it has Delusions of Grandeur is a pretty funny critique of these particular creatives, because Disco Elysium has this kind of grandeur that it is putting out there and what it believes and what it wants to talk about. And I actually think they do a really good job of not just kind of descending into political polemics That's one of the reasons I really like Disco Elysium. But it definitely has a perspective, and I think that is borne out from the Medium post. Right, we didn't talk about it, but the very last thing they say in their Medium post accusing Zaum of fraud is, we believe in the law. It's not perfect, but it's there to protect those who create from those who take, and so it will. I would never describe the law that way. The law is a mechanism written by people, flawed as they might be, interpreted by those same people and enforced by other people with the same flaws. And I don't know that its goal is to protect those who create from those who take, but I can certainly see how one can get there. Talking about
wish casting, I think, in some way.
Yeah. Maybe it is. Yeah, it's what we want the law to be, right? And so that, they're advocating for their position in the law. I think we can always advocate for justice. We want the law to be great and good and help the downtrodden and give redress to those who are harmed. But that's the kind of writing you see in Disco Elysium. And that's where, from a business person's perspective, you start to go, okay, we might be in trouble if they are really willing to put their money where their mouth is on this stuff. And again, it depends a lot on the facts behind the scenes. Now, they do have those interviews in the game industry biz folks that talk to people at the company from all sounds of things that say that they really do have some arguments that there was a certain amount of toxicity at the company. And so they'll lean on that. So it really is a kind of mutually assured destruction, burn the whole thing down. If you proceed with that, ordinarily you'd be able to pay your way out of that kind of situation. I'm not sure here, but that's what makes it fascinating, right? This is a crazy story about a crazy game. Disco Elysium is like no other game. And it is super interesting on both the legal perspective, the cultural perspective, the critiques of capitalism perspective, and everything else.
Yeah, and just the meta of it in terms of the way this is all playing out, which is why I loved that statement from that Martin Lugia guy, which is he realized like they got too close. What I read at in it is like we got close to the sun, and exactly what we said would happen. It happened, and it's not some abstract thing. It actually happened to us, which is powerful. That's why I'm saying like take it and make more art. Like run the ball. And fuck these guys,
No, make a game about you losing a video game studio. Just go triple meta on it. It'd be interesting. I think they will crowdfund. I would guess. I mean, they have big enough names. This is a big enough deal. We are only a couple of months away from this all breaking. If I were in their shoes, if I was a business advisor, just go crowdfund something. And you can still feel a little bit less capitalistic about that. It's a collective writ large, other than Kickstarter's 10% or what have you. So I think they will have space to do that.
And they also know it. I mean, it's just kind of throwaway stuff. And if people are curious, in the Estonian newspaper article that they're working on a game code named Pioneer 1 that apparently doesn't involve those guys, and that both Microsoft and Tencent were interested suitors, at least at some point. Would have been interesting to see them get purchased by. I don't think you want to get involved with a company that's run by people like communists, basically. I can't deny the art. And I can't deny communist art generally. Not that they're known for art, not that they're known for video games. When you look at the propaganda posters and the mosaics and all the beautiful things that come from the Soviet era, it's like, okay, there's something here. But yeah, there's something I respect, though disagree with, about what they were doing. And I'm not surprised. I completely believe, for what it's worth, that they weren't doing anything probably for a couple of years. Because I believe that it's not champagne socialism. It's just like, we'll figure it out when the next game comes. We figured it out last time. Now we have money to figure it out. So we have time. I don't know. I want to know more. We're going to have to wait for more. Hopefully we can convene again in the coming months and get further into this. But
oh, sure. I'd be happy to. You could definitely imagine a situation in which they're just like, no, it took us 6 years to make Disco Elysium in our heads, and you're going to have to live with that. That's our creative process. That's the kind of thing you get from creatives and business folks. And so at its most benign level, this friction makes all the sense in the world. Outside of fraud, outside of toxicity and discrimination and everything else, just the nature of a kind of lightning striking video game being created from a small group of creatives, and then somebody trying to make it into a company is always going to look very problematic in almost all instances, especially for the folks that aren't used to operating in a corporate environment, right? And you see this in much bigger terms. I would describe Bungie as a company that clings to its creativity and eschews every single corporate partnership it's ever entered into. I'm looking at you, Sony. Hang on to your hats.
I know.
But like that's what they've done for forever. They like to feel independent and a little bit outside of step. And so they sign up with Microsoft, say, they sign up with Activision, they say, now they sign up with Sony, we'll see. But it is, I don't think it is just unique to three Estonians talking about these things. You always have creative versus business. And it's one of the really interesting things to watch because somehow a lot of them make it work and we get really grand stuff.
Yeah, well said. Well, it was fun to get into this story, and I hope that people enjoyed it because I didn't see much coverage about it. This will probably, not probably. I mean, I think this will for sure be the most comprehensive look anywhere on the internet of what's going on with this. So I appreciate you taking the time to do it with us, Hoeg.
This is fun stuff, Colin. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fun too. So we'll have you. Well, people have already seen the God of War spoiler cast, but we'll have you again.
Wasn't I amazing?
You were awesome. I can't believe when Nathan Drake showed up.
Oh my God,
it was absolutely insane. But
yeah.
But we'll see you again, no doubt. Happy holidays to you. Happy holidays to everyone out there, and thank you for your love, kindness, and support of all things Last Stand. We'll see you next time for more. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.